come on in. No. Well, good morning, everybody. I don't want to keep you all waiting, so we are going to get started. I'm delighted to be here this morning in the Sustainable Hub tent for a series of really fascinating talks about nature, farming, food and climate change, and how all of these things can be brought together. Now, we were supposed to have John Gibbons to kick us off this morning, but unfortunately John suffered a family bereavement during the night and had to leave. He is on his way to Cork at the moment, so unfortunately he can't be with us today. But he sends his apologies. He had done a lot of preparation, he told me, but I know from experience that Oonagh definitely, and I'm sure John as well, will be able to cover much of the same territory, and many of the speakers that we have coming in later today will touch on the kind of points that I know John would have been making about the overall direction of Irish agriculture and how we can make the model that we have operating here in Ireland more sustainable. So I'm delighted to introduce to you this morning Oonagh Duggan, who is Head of Policy and Advocacy at Birdwatch Ireland. She has been working in the environmental movement in different organisations for 25 years and is a passionate advocate of biodiversity, particularly on behalf of Irish birds, and she's going to tell us about her work. But she's also the daughter of a dairy farmer, and we also have with us today John McHugh, and John is a fascinating advocate for Farming for Nature, which is a network of farmers that pool ideas and share information with the public about the efforts they make on their farms to enhance biodiversity and promote nature conservation. And there are many, many different types of farms in this network. It's an absolutely fascinating project, and the idea of it is to showcase what's actually possible even within the current model. But John is also an organic dairy farmer, so I'm hoping we can tease out what the implications of switching to organic are for biodiversity and for climate change. But just to set us off this morning, I'm going to hand the mic over to Oonagh, who's going to just paint a picture for us of what the biodiversity picture is like in Ireland at the moment. Where are we at? What do we need to do? How bad is it? And what role does agriculture and food policy play in enhancing biodiversity? So, welcome, Oonagh.
Well, I hope I don't go on too long. You might have to cut me off. So, hi everybody. Okay. So, the status of biodiversity in Ireland, what are we looking at? So, we'll just focus with land. Obviously not go into the marine, but we sometimes forget about the marine, so that's a whole other area that requires focus and not to forget about. But on land, like birds are one of the most studied groups of biodiversity, I suppose, and so they're really are the proverbial canaries in the coal mine. So because they're relatively well studied, we have some really good data on the status of birds, and they can tell us about the health of the wider environment and what's going on. So in Ireland, 63% of our 211 regularly occurring bird species are in trouble. There's 27% are undergoing severe decline, and 54% are in moderate decline. So it's a very stark situation for Irish birds. So the primary drivers of their declines have been changes in agriculture and land use, including peat cutting, drainage, and all the other activities that are associated with, I suppose, these changes mainly since around the 70s, since Ireland joined the Common Agricultural Policy. So mechanisation, specialisation, all the different changes that come with increasing productivity have led to this situation. But so farmland birds, so we did our 4th assessment of the birds of conservation concern in Ireland. We started these assessments in 1998 for the island of Ireland, and the fourth assessment, which was published in 2021, shows that the situation is just getting worse every time we do this. So we're really worried, like what's going to happen in 2026 when we do the next one. We can't keep seeing just declines. We're just monitoring declines, like it's terrible. So, but farmland birds in particular, as a group of birds, many of them are ground nesters. They nest on the ground. Not all birds nest in trees. A lot of people don't know that. They're getting worse fastest. So they're in the worst situation. So then other issues then in relation to biodiversity, I suppose, is bees, our wild bee species. With 99 wild bees, 1/3 of them are threatened with extinction. And bees are, again, there's a monitoring program for bees, and even that's quite young, relatively speaking, as well. But there's a whole rake of other taxa, as we call it, species groups, that we haven't studied. And we don't really know what's happening with them. But all you have to do is, I don't know how many of you kind of would remember maybe in the 80s and even in the 90s, driving in the countryside and coming home in the nighttime and your car is covered in dead insects. That does not happen anymore. You'd be hard pressed to see a car covered with insects anymore. So that's it's anecdotal, but it's an indicator. People remember that. My aunt told me once, she grew up in West Limerick, and she's like, Oonagh, when I was going to school in the 50s, and you'd be deafened by the sound of birdsong in the countryside. And, that same area, because I have a lot of family there, you'd be hard pressed to see a thrush, or you might get a blackbird or a robin, but just we're losing that diversity. We're losing the diversity and the abundance of species. They're just not there anymore. So, and again, the habitat is not there for them. They're being squeezed out of the countryside. It's less hospitable for them. But just one final thing before I'll move on, and that is, so we've been documenting declines in like the curlew and corncrake. Corncrake really got hit in the 1970s. There used to be corncrake in North Dublin City, which is city, like the city. But recently, we have recently common species also declining. So kestrel and snipe. The kestrel is a bird of prey that hovers. You might see it along roadsides and stuff. You mightn't see it anymore though, because it is being relegated to motorways, the side of motorways, because that's where the rough grassland is, and the west of Ireland. But the kestrel was a recently common species, and even that's declining now. And that just broke my heart when I saw that, because it's a stunning bird. It's a predator high up on the food chain. We believe that what's happening there is that the habitat for its prey species is not there anymore, but also secondary poisoning from rodenticide, from rat poison being used. The birds eat the rats and the mice, and then they get it and they have a slow, painful death. But so that's just a picture of what's going on. It's not very happy, is it? Sorry. But there are some.
Well, just before I hand over to John, I have to ask you this question, right? Tongue in cheek. But so what? So what if we lose all these birds? What difference does that make to us? You said they're very important indicators of other things happening in ecosystems. But do the birds themselves provide ecosystem services?
Absolutely. So the birds are the indicators of what's going on, in the wider countryside. So, if you lose the curlew, you're losing wet grasslands, you're losing peatlands. So it's not just about losing one species, you're losing the whole support infrastructure for that species. So you're losing diversity. And in genetic diversity, we need to have variety. It just makes for healthier systems. And we also don't know, if you pull one, it's like the Jenga. If you pull one, little brick out of the Jenga tower, we don't really know what the implications could be in the wider food chain for species, because I said birds are relatively well studied, but there's the whole area of science around biodiversity just needs a lot more research. But also the birds are they do provide their own ecosystem services, like pollination. They would some bird species, especially globally, would be really important for pollinating flowers and plants and crops that we need. But also, there's the jay, which is a woodland bird, and the jay caches. It hides. It picks up acorns and hides them, and then it's like your natural tree planter. really. So they are, they also control pests, they eat insects. But, one of the things we noticed at Birdwatch Ireland during COVID, the amount, when people just got a chance to stop, like our traffic to our website went up like a huge 200% or something, because people wanted to know more about the birds they were seeing in their gardens and listening to. And there's a lot of joy that people get from bird song and just the interaction with birds and seeing them. So they perform roles that are scientifically robust. We can see what the roles they're doing, but then there's a lot of intangibles that we just can't even, it's just hearing a bird in the morning is something. How do you put a value on that?
Well, that's a great answer to my question. And I have one more question for you before we go over to John, which is, if you can just outline for us very briefly what the drivers of the habitat loss what the drivers are, because you mentioned that as the key thing that is causing the decline in biodiversity and in bird species in Ireland. But why is that happening? Who's to blame?
And blaming is a tricky one, because I'll get back to that. But okay, so habitat loss and degradation. So the habitats for wild birds are, like, let's say, drainage of small wet grasslands, drainage of peatlands. I mean, the peat bogs have been a really they're unique. They don't host a massive amount of wildlife, but the ones that they do host are unique and fabulous. Like, insect-eating plants. They have to survive in a very, specific way. So it's loss of habitat. They're just the habitats that they need are not there anymore. So, like a curlew would need tussocky kind of grasslands that are wet, so they have that very long bill, so it can probe into the ground for invertebrates. Here's a great one though. Like, do you know a lapwing? Do you know what a lapwing looks like? It's a gorgeous wader. We call it a breeding wader, and it's green plumage, and they've got a little quiff. They're really cute. But lapwing, when they have their chicks, my colleague up in Belmullet was telling me this. A lapwing will walk 2 kilometres with his or her chicks to get to a field where there's cattle in it that have poached the ground, so that they can probe into the ground to get invertebrates for their chicks. 2 kilometres walking down, crossing fields. Jeez, imagine like a little chick this size having to walk 2 kilometres. So it's just amazing. So yeah, look, there, loss of habitat, degradation of habitat, and just, I suppose, the changes have come so fast in agriculture in particular that the species just can't keep up. So like with mowing, like big tractors going into fields and mowing, in July when the chicks are in the field, like the chicks get mowed over. So there's changes you can do, like centre out mowing, so the chicks have a chance to get to the hills, the sides in time. But basically also the pollution of waterways now, greater fertilizer use. Like kingfisher is an amber listed species now, and we're just waiting for it to go red. It's going to go red because it's modifications of the rivers, arterial drainage. But also the increased pollution, because kingfisher watches where the prey is, and if the water is terrible quality, they can't see them. So it's basics. I can't see where my food is. So these are the kinds of things that are happening. So that's what it is, habitat loss. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Oonagh. And by the way, if anybody wants to come in, there's some seats up here at the front. You're very welcome to come on in. So I'm now delighted to introduce John to you. John McHugh is a farmer, a dairy farmer in County Laois, but passionate about biodiversity. So I'm just going to hand over to you, John, and you can tell us the story of how you have come into this farming for nature space.
Okay, well, hello everybody. So yeah, I farm just outside Port Laois town in the parish of Ballyfin, and I'm an organic dairy farmer. And I'm a 5th generation farmer, so I suppose, yeah, like I know the history. We're very much linked to the place I live, and my father was very interested in history. And so I suppose to flesh out even what Oonagh was saying, I can see how all these changes have happened, and most of them probably in my generation and my father's generation. So if I go back, I suppose when he started farming, I suppose the 60s, was seen the start of 50s and 60s, seen tractors becoming mainstream. it was a gradual industrialisation, and I suppose once we joined the EU, it brought a lot of money into the country, and there was grants for draining land, taking out hedgerows. So my father done all of these things. So like much of our farm was drained, huge amounts of hedgerows were taken out, and this was all progress. There was like amazing, beautiful big trees bulldozed down. It wasn't at the time, there wasn't much thought about this. It was seen as opening fields up into making it more accessible for machinery, and it was progress, and it was feeding people, and it was all seen as a positive thing. And I suppose 10 years later we had grain mountains and butter mountains, and so this was cheap food was a result of this, and so again that wasn't seen as a bad thing. And I suppose even my father, actually, he went through this. So he, I said, cleared scrub, took out hedgerows. But actually, in the 80s, he a kind of sense of guilt. And so he kept diaries all through the years. And I could go back and read them. And I could read stories how he kind of regretted taking out certain trees that were big landmarks, that everyone would have known around. And he had a sense of remorse, I think, about this. And he did start to plant hedgerows back into the farm, and planted areas, awkward corners off fields. So he started doing his bit. I suppose he did see the negatives of this. And as most farmers, they're working with the land day in, day out, and they very much are tied into the health of that land. And I suppose the big thing is we didn't end up here by accident. That's I think some people think that we did, but this was very much. If anyone looks into the history of the Green Revolution, which was, you could say, the chemical revolution. It was pushed from I suppose after World War II, it really was pushed. Because there was a lot of food and poverty, and so it was encouraged. It was encouraged to start, and it was difficult to actually make these changes. Farmers were reluctant to change, so this was very much encouraged to get farmers to start spreading fertilizers, and so we became much more and more narrowly focused. So. In the past, obviously, people and communities were very much connected to their food systems. There wasn't middlemen. There wasn't, there was a very strong direct connection between people and food. But I suppose over the years, particularly from the 70s on, supermarkets became mainstream, and there was all these intermediaries between now the farmers and the food system, and that, drove farmers to start focusing and specialising. Again, the average farmer would have been a mixed farmer in the past, and now, they start to specialise. And so when I took over the farm back in start of 2000s, it was a mixed farm. There was some tillage on the farm, there was sheep on the farm, there was 35 dairy cows, and so I started to. The first thing I done was actually get rid of sheep and start specialisation, and so I increased the dairy herd, which is the most profitable enterprise. So I started focusing on dairy cows, and I suppose my focus at the time was how much money could I make out of this farm. And so we were encouraged, again, to treat the farm like a business, and so I suppose my two focuses were making it very labour efficient and to maximise the profit I could make off the land. And that wasn't I didn't question that. That seemed like a fairly good ideal to focus at. And so particularly between 2005 2006, I built a new milking parlour, and milk quota started to free up around that time. Between then and 2015, I had expanded up to 160 dairy cows, was ready to jump to 200 dairy cows, and that was the point where I suppose I, like my father, I started questioning everything I was doing and this narrow focus, and I started to read. I knew about organic farming, but I was still relatively ignorant about it. And for me, I seen organic farming as a first step for me to stop solely focusing on profit and solely focusing on milk outputs, and to maybe to focus on resilience instead. And that's what I felt I had lost in all that time. I was now, I had moved from being largely, much more in control of so when I started farming, I wasn't in debt. I was able to do a lot of the work myself, and with neighbours. There was a lot more help and cooperation between neighbours, and all of these things, I suppose, faded out. You became much more dependent on borrowed money. You became dependent on bought-in labour. You became dependent on bought-in contractors and machinery. You became more dependent on bought-in fertilisers and pesticides. All of these things increased, I suppose. as I narrowed that focus, and all of these things allowed that specialisation. That's what facilitated, and so for me, I wanted again, organic was the first step towards cutting all of them things out. And as I said, there's a lot more. Obviously, if John Gibbons had set the scene, he would have said it as, we're in this desperate, dire situation, and we are. Like it is. Oonagh said, like I can directly see, practices that I have done that have affected a lot of these different birds and different, obviously, pollinators, so much more. And I can also see the opposite. I can also see the practices that I'm doing now and how they're actually benefiting that again. And so from that point of view, I would say there is hope.
So thank you so much, John. What I'd love to hear is what are those practices? What are the changes that you've made on the farm? And also, what does going organic, what difference does that actually make? You still have the same number of cows, right? So what? No?
So I suppose so organic. The first thing is it cuts out chemical fertilizers, particularly soluble chemical fertilizers. It'll cut out pesticide use. So it's a more natural way of farming. So so for instance, the biggest thing with me was be cutting out artificial nitrogen first of all. So artificial nitrogen really drives grass growth. And phosphorus and potassium as well, and so both of them. So phosphorus is an interesting one because probably the single biggest effect on biodiversity within grasslands and within is phosphorus. And when you spread phosphorus on a field, it can take 30 years after that last application of phosphorus for some of the species. Some species are just going to disappear straight away. So if we want diverse grasslands, again, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they're going to promote the most aggressive growers, which will be, the strong growing grasses like perennial ryegrass, and so it's going to make our pastures much more monoculture. So straight away, there's the first step, you could say, in diversity disappearing. And obviously, when a lot of these other species disappear within our pastures, that's going to have, again, effect on birds, it's going to have effect on butterflies and moths and pollinators. It's a snowball that starts accumulating, and so again, then obviously, within a tillage situation, or even within a dairy situation, for instance, or certain pesticides used. So obviously, lots of farmers might be worming their cows with ivermectins and things like this, and they will again kill dung beetles. And there's this cumulative. There's knock-on effects because these are the bottom rung of the food chain. And so obviously, again, pollinators, our birds are going to be eating some of these dung beetles. And so the effect, I've seen an interesting study before on nitrogen use and on pastures and the effect it had on the amount of caterpillars that made it to become a butterfly. So again, because nitrogen, it boosts growth, but it actually reduces the quality of that grass. There's going to be less, and so if it's having that effect on caterpillars reaching maturity as butterfly, well, obviously it has health implications on cows as well, and it has health implications for humans as well. It's the broader environment that gets affected.
But what are you using if you're not using nitrogen? I mean, do you have more land as a result of going organic for pasture?
So I suppose I've just reduced my stocking rate. So I suppose originally farmers. So this is where I think organic is a key component of actually bringing things back into balance. Because when you're organic, when you have chemicals to fall back on, it allows you to do things that nature wouldn't facilitate otherwise. So it allows you to specialize. It allows you to sustain a lot more animals than would normally. So it allows maybe the animal herd to become overly inflated, in a country. So it facilitates all these things, and it kind of wallpapers over the cracks within the system. Where if you have bad management within an organic system, if you really destroy a field, you're going to suffer straight away. There's no crutch to fall back on. And so I think it's just, it's you have to work with nature. You have to respect nature, because if you don't, you're going to go out of business. So for instance, for me, I operate at a stocking rate. So stocking rate is the amount of cows you have on a unit of land. So my stocking rate is one livestock unit, which is equivalent to one cow on a hectare of ground. And so the average for the country, I don't know what the actual average for the country, because it's probably not as high as, but on intensive farms, before I went organic, I was at the very upper end of intensiveness. So I had 2.9 livestock units per hectare. So that was the upper end. You have to get a derogation to be a special derogation to be in, just say, stocked that heavily, and so that allows you to spread 240 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. It allows you to, and you have to do all these practices to sustain that stocking rate. So it kind of ties you into an input-dependent system. So when you take the pressure off, so nitrogen is freely available in the air. So nature has its way of cycling all these nutrients, but it works at a certain level. And so obviously chemical fertilizers have allowed us to multiply that, and they've allowed us to feed huge amounts of people, between World War II and now, they've allowed us to make huge jumps in the amount of food we've produced, but obviously at a huge cost, and I suppose the key is there is other ways to do it, and there was people back in the 1930s and 40s who were warning about everything that's happened now, and showed a different way. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask John a question, because when I was growing up on the farm, and that's how I got my love for nature, because of the nature that was on our farm, but I loved being out with the cows and doing the farm work, and it was just amazing. But my dad was like, don't go farming, it's a dead loss, don't. He just totally put us off it. So this was back like in the 90s, and like, he was finding it harder and harder to make a living off 50 dairy cows on 80 acres. So like, with the price of organic, what you can get for organic milk, does that help? Is it good enough for farmers to make the jump? Like, because, it's easy to talk about telling farmers to diversify, but at the end of the day, they're trying to educate kids and deal with all kinds of family situations, normal family life, that with all its hassles that all the rest of us have, and they're just trying to make ends meet. So, like, is it worth the jump?
No. Well, to answer that, I suppose currently the organic milk price is lower than conventional milk price. So yeah. So now you could say that's a bit of an anomaly in the year that we're after having, where there's been huge inflation. So essentially conventional milk prices have shot through the roof. They've practically doubled nearly. Or they've risen a huge amount in the last year. Where organic milk price, I was tied into a 2-year contract on a fixed price. So the other side of that is I have a vastly lower cost structure. Again, so like fertilizer prices have jumped so hugely in the last year. So it's possibly been the milk price has risen probably more than compensated for the input prices. But still, as a conventional farmer, you're very dependent on the prices of inputs, and yeah. But
no, I was just going to ask you, and to go back to something you said earlier, which is you mentioned that by going organic, you increased your resilience. You didn't have the debt. You weren't relying on it. Brought in labour and equipment and fertilizer and all of the rest of it, and also you're not sort of vulnerable to those price shocks that you've just mentioned. But the number of farmers that are farming organically in Ireland is much lower here than it is in other European countries. For some reason, it hasn't kind of taken off, even though the awareness among farmers has increased, and we'll hear from other farmers for nature today. So there's a keen interest in farmers to do things differently, and yet the organic option doesn't seem to be attractive enough. And I've always been curious as to why that's the case. Maybe you can enlighten us.
Well, it's more straightforward than you think. So, for instance, obviously in Ireland we have a large agricultural industry, and so industry might be the word that we need to focus on there, as opposed to farmers. And so for the industry, which the food industry in general works on quite low margins. So, for instance, if you're Glanbia, you might be trading on a 3 or 4% margin. If for instance Ireland decided we're going to go organic in the morning, and every farmer essentially halves their cow numbers or reduces them greatly, the first thing is organic doesn't work on an 8% margin. They're not going to double their margin. They're going to still be stuck on probably a 3 or 4% margin, and only now trading on much less product. And on top of that, then conventional farmers buy a lot of inputs, which the ag industry also sells to these conventional farmers. So again, there's a huge loss. There will be a huge loss to the industry. But again, not necessarily a loss for farmers, and not necessarily a gain for farmers, but a big gain for the environment.
It is really interesting because we were associated with the environmental pillar kind of network of NGOs about the development of the Food Vision 2030 strategy, and there was a kind of a poll done of, as part of a public consultation for this, and so there was over 200 respondents. So it's not over the 1,000 where it would be representative, but it was a bit of a snapshot. But I think it was like 64% of the farmers who responded to that poll said that the last agri-food strategy didn't serve them. It wasn't about them, and we know from minutes at the meetings that some farming representative organisations said, well, yeah, if this is, they also said it's done nothing for farmers. So there is something there about the primary producer not getting enough of of the reward within the whole structure to keep going. Because when I hear about the margins, we're all trying to look at solutions to how to bring more biodiversity back, to restoring water quality, and it always comes back to this: is what makes it viable for the farmer to be able to change tack or do things a different way, and also recognizing that change isn't easy. A lot of people have been maybe doing the same thing for a long time, and it's been ingrained that this is how you do it, and it's difficult to even see agri-environment schemes getting done on the ground. Farmers need the support to do it. And I asked my brother, I was down at home, and I was saying, what would Dad say now? It's 25% cuts in emissions. What would he say? And we both agreed that he literally would want somebody to come onto the farm and go, right, this is how I've been doing things. I left school at 12. Tell me, help me. And if there is, what do I do with water quality? How do I make a living on this then? Because this is it. This is my platform to make a living. And if I have to change, I need help in how to change. And I think it's going to have to come down to farm level to really work with people on the ground. And we see that with the agri-environment schemes, which for the most part, billions have been spent on agri-environment schemes like GLAS and REPS, and they have been an absolute catastrophic waste of money because they have not. Biodiversity is getting worse, as I just described. So but we know what the solution is there, and that is targeted, on the ground, bespoke ecological supports, working with farmers on their land to help them make decisions on changing practice. So this whole behavioural change is all about the farm advisory services. I think is a huge missing link, and there's only 700 of them in the country, farm advisors. They go out on the farms and they work with people. So that's, to me, is a key solution in all of this, is on the ground helping people.
Can I ask John how you see it from your perspective? So we've just talked about biodiversity this morning, but there's also the climate change issue. And Oonagh mentioned the fact that the emission ceilings that have been adopted by government will require 25% reduction in emissions from the agricultural sector. How do you see that playing out? And what role does switching towards organic farming play in achieving those emission reductions, if at all?
I think it potentially could have a huge role. Whether it will or not is a different story. So I think obviously how we're in this place where we are now, it's much more complicated than, to me it's very much tied into industrialization and globalization. And so sometimes I think, people try to reduce the argument down to, for instance, there's a huge narrative about animal agriculture being bad, and the IPCC is saying that we need to reduce our meat consumption by 8%, and to me that is, there's a saying where if you use the same level of thinking that got you into a problem to get you out of a problem, you're not going. It's kind of madness. And to me, it's reductionist thinking. So to me, it's not an issue about animal agriculture or vegetables or crops, or it's about industrial production. And so sustainable, to farm sustainably, to me, it has to involve animals. It's an interaction between animals and crops, and they both have to be in balance. And and that has always been the case, and was the case before, I suppose, fertilizers came into the scene and allowed this imbalance to and pesticides allowed this imbalance to happen. They allowed the separation of animals and crop production, and so that is very much tied into industrialization and then globalization. That has allowed, you could say, what we see now, this extremely unbalanced production system within Ireland, where it's hugely focused on dairying and beef, and vegetable producers have went out of business. And this was all seen. This facilitated cheap food, and it was amazing that we had supermarkets full of every kind of exotic vegetable and fruit. But when I see solutions being offered, I see lots of new laws and protections to come in, and part of me feels it's a little bit disingenuous, because it's like we're not addressing what the real root problems were, which to me, globalization is part of it. So for instance, we're handicapped in how we respond to this, and if we respond to it in certain ways, I think we potentially could destroy our food system. We could potentially create a whole array of new problems on top of a climate and biodiversity problem, because we see how volatile the world is becoming, and food security all of a sudden is a huge issue again. And it's very difficult to make all these changes without that we need to make, and without hugely undermining our production systems. And I think, if the problem is so serious, then maybe we do have to start looking at individual countries, reintroduction of tariffs and certain limits to actually, bring about that diversification within a country again, to make vegetable production profitable within Ireland again, to allow all these various different enterprises, so that I think we're approaching the problem. There's often this term, global solutions for global problems, and this is very much being pushed on us. This is a global problem, we have to address it with. And to me, that is a very flawed methodology, because you can't feed the world. It's an impossible task, but you can feed a community. It starts from the bottom, and so we need to start feeding our own communities in a sustainable manner and building upwards. If we're trying to put the roof on a house without having the foundations laid with these top-down approaches. And so that's where it starts. And I don't see much of that, unfortunately, in any of the solutions that are being proposed. I see more laws. I see more, we have, looking for rights for nature and all of these things, but they're all top-down approaches that aren't addressing the real problem. And there's these huge conflicts of interest that are within, so as a commercially, obviously, if you're a dairy farmer, there's profit to be made. So that's pushing you in one direction. Within the last cap, there was, I would have been penalised for having areas that weren't productive agriculture, and that, it's going to be addressed in the new cap. But that's the future, for instance, and there's a legacy of the damage done by that, because, I know of farmers who had inspectors out, with a wheel measuring around each tree to deduct out off their land. I can see when the Department of Agriculture all of a sudden start to penalise more farmers. I could see gorse bushes being bulldozed out of fields, because they were being penalised on this, and so then they had to react to that. And there's a legacy of that, and the next cap might remove that, but it's the following. It's going to take 10 years for that to take effect, and for farmers to. I've no doubt farmers will respond if there's a lot of blame has to lay on policy in the past, and so to me the first step is actually addressing all these negatives within policy.
There's so much in that response. Thank you, John. I'd love to channel my inner John Gibbons and kind of challenge you on the livestock model, but I'm conscious that we're running out of time, and perhaps people have questions they'd like. Oh my goodness, the hand's jumping up. So I don't have a microphone to go around, so if you'd like to just stand up and speak loudly so that everyone can hear. Right.
We would reduce, to some extent, we can only feed half the population of the world.
Yeah, so like I can't obviously say I have all the answers on these things, but what I can say is, so on my individual farm, these are things I have thought about. So first of all, so people, like, again, if John Gibbons was here, he would say that animals are really poor use of land, that they don't produce a lot of food calories or whatever else. And to me, that again is very reductionist. It's kind of missing the point. So to me, animals are integral to the diversity of our landscape. They're integral, so on my farm, for instance, my cows, there's no inputs fed. They're not fed any grains, concentrates. They're they're maintaining a huge area of land and maintaining a huge area of diversity at no cost and producing food. But within that, they're also building fertility. But also, so for instance, so for me, I wanted to diversify my farm and also to produce, a whole array of things. And physically, that wasn't going to be possible for me to try and become a vegetable farmer, to try and become a. So I have a little community garden on the farm. So there's like 12 different families at the minute. There'll be 15 next year, and they're all growing their own vegetables. And so there's actually a huge amount of food being produced in that area. So to me, overall, my farm is not less productive. I'm now producing much more varied outputs. That doesn't have an environmental cost. So I've no doubt we can actually we could be. I do think we can feed the world. So it would involve, yes, huge shifts in how we eat. And I don't think these shifts should be forced upon people. I think they can naturally develop because. But like, so I don't think, for instance, this idea of meat taxes or trying to force reductions of meat on people. I think if you need to address the source of the problem, and so maybe that is tied into maybe fertilizer taxes or something like that. I don't even actually think that's an adequate way to deal with it either. But so yes, we can produce a lot of food on a small area. So obviously Ireland back in the 1840s had 8 million people, and obviously we did have a famine. We were huge. We also were exporting food out of the country at the same time. But again, most famines have often been tied into lots of other political and problems like that. But so you can. It's amazing. I think there's studies done that like a tenth of an acre, how much it can actually feed. It's huge. And I think the most productive system of food production is called bio-intensive agriculture. So it's like horticulture. It's a and you can keep. So there is huge scope to produce a lot of food on a small area. But again, I think that it's not about trying to feed the world. It's again trying to feed a community, and starting at that level is how it happens. And I've no doubt that animal agriculture is part of it.
So I'd just like to just a couple of other hands up. I think you had your hands up, and then you have better.
I just want to make a point. I think I discovered a new species. It's a vegetable. Look, something like a dinosaur. And it has been, from the age of cherries, fox, they are very active. They eat the leaves down, they put the leaves down, eating into the ground, taking out the trees, taking out the ditches, making space for the new green desert. The green desert is born from the fertilizer of protein. But I would say no to proteins, milk and beef.
So you're talking about the digger. I know this species. I wouldn't be a big fan unless it's blocking drains in a bog.
The environment is damaged, and I went together with the supply
Thank you. Yeah, I just would like the panel's view on an interesting email we got into our Hedgerows Ireland inbox yesterday that made the point that public awareness raising is all very well, but it only goes so far. And this person made the point that the EU regulations in terms of, for example, hedgerow removal are so badly implemented and transposed into Irish law that they are doing so much more damage. And it's all very well people knowing about problems, but implementation of regulations and the nature of regulations is also part of the problem. Now, John, you mentioned the problems with regulations, but do you see, and maybe Oonagh as well, see a problem with the way that we actually transpose EU regulations into the Irish situation?
I have a big bee in my bonnet about regulations relating to hedgerows. Hedgerows are so important in an Irish landscape. I mean, they provide food and shelter for animals and for people. People like to go out foraging for blackberries. But, so here's the thing I discovered this year. Well, it was because I sat on the CAP, the Common Agriculture Consultative Committee, for the last 2.5 years as a representative of the environmental pillar. So we had 33 meetings. Some of them went on for 4 hours each. So it was quite a commitment and allowed me to really in-depthly look at the regulation. But one of the conditions of the basic payment that farmers get, it's called the direct payment as well, under the CAP, is that, so they have conditions and laws that they have to meet. One of the conditions is retain landscape features. Hedgerows in Ireland are a landscape feature. So you'd think that all the hedgerows would be retained then. No. The Irish government has been allowing the removal of 500 metres, up to 500 metres of hedgerow on an annual basis since 2008, 2009. Even though the regulation says retain. Retain means keep. So I couldn't believe this. So that's 500 metres is a lot in a local area. And it could have severe implications for biodiversity. Like, so imagine if you had 3 or 4 farms in an area and they all decided to take out 500 metres that year and another maybe 500 somewhere else. That it just could be devastating. But not only that, over 500 metres, a farmer can remove. If a farmer wants to remove over 500 metres, they have to apply for environmental impact assessment screening. But a colleague of ours did a review of all the applications for screening that they received, that the Department of Agriculture received, and he found that a third of the applications that were approved, so the department said, yes, you can remove this, didn't even have the length of hedgerow that was going to be removed on it. So there was this blanket signing off on things, like, yeah, go ahead, remove those hedgerows. But it could have been 5 kilometres. Who knows? It wasn't written down. And it was the form that they have to fill out. Everything is in the details, folks. The form that they had to fill out didn't even ask, it's environmental impact assessment, right? Didn't even ask a question beyond, is it in an SAC, a special area conservation? There was no detail on, is there a red-listed bird using it? Like barn owl. They forage along hedgerow lines. Bats do as well. They love these linear features in the landscape. There was no question about the ecology of the area. So anyway, I just have gone like single pointed determination after this. And now it's only going to be, a removal will only be allowed in exceptional circumstances. And thanks as well to Alan for your help in this, but it's just been, makes no sense and makes a mockery of regulation. So when you have, that's in the CAP, you know. So look, there's been a lot, like we don't have a bespoke law to protect hedgerows in Ireland. I think that's really essential that we have something that protects them because they are so important when you're looking at the dearth of woodland in the country. So did I answer that enough? Okay. I don't think we're good. We're terrible at breaking the law, failing to transpose. Even the Wildlife Act is not in line with the Birds Directive to protect birds properly. So we're failing on the basics, and that is really hard when you're trying to go from, we're trying to restore species populations. Now it's all about nature restoration. But when you don't even have the right laws transposed properly, you know, yeah, we have a long road to go.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for an absolutely fascinating discussion. And we could talk all day, but wonderfully, we have other speakers coming in who will follow up on these topics. I hope you'll be able to stay and join in. Now, nobody needs to leave the tent because it's lashing rain outside, but we are going to wind up with this session now so we can just get ourselves ready for the next speaker, who's Owen Daltoon, who's the author of a best-selling book about the Irish Atlantic rainforest. So I'm hoping you'll all either stay or come back at 12 o'clock to hear Owen tell us about his work and his book. And I believe you might have some copies to sell as well. I hope you do. Oh, you don't? Yes. Well, that just tells you how popular it is. I was in Dubray Books in Dublin city centre the other day, and it was on the bestsellers shelf. So I never thought I would see the day when a book about Irish Atlantic rainforest was a bestseller, but that just shows you the public interest in your work and what you're doing is growing all the time. But let's just say a big thank you to John McHugh and to Oonagh Duggan for their enlightening contributions today. And I hope to see you back at 12 o'clock for the next session. Thank you.